Welcome to the first episode of the Asian Faces Healthcare Places podcast, a show where we explore the careers of Asians in the business of healthcare, what they do, how they got there, and how their Asian heritage and upbringing impacted their paths. I'm your host, Edward Lai, and for this inaugural episode, I'm excited to be speaking with Priya Bathija, founder and CEO of New Health. Well, we're happy to kick off the inaugural episode of Asian Faces Healthcare Places with a conversation with our guest today, Priya Bathija. Priya, how are you doing today?
I'm great, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be part of the first episode.
Yeah, and for context, Priya and I had kind of engaged previously, but we've never kind of seen each other in person like this. We've talked on the phone and messaged on LinkedIn, so it's great to be able to see you in person on Zoom like this.
Yeah, it really is. And it's so crazy to think that we met just through you starting a common group on LinkedIn, the Association of Asian Healthcare Leaders. And I think we've crossed paths in other groups like the Advancement League. So it's nice to be with you virtually in person.
Yeah, that's right. The healthcare world is pretty small in some ways, but also I'm finding pretty large. Well, you kind of touched upon it, Priya, but I think we first met on LinkedIn. What do you recall, if any, coming across? You mentioned our AAHL group, which I'm very proud of ourselves. But do you recall how we met each other?
No idea. I think I think it was just through being a part of that group and watching what each other were posting over the past couple of years on LinkedIn. And then I know we've been sort of at the same virtual events throughout the pandemic. But
right. No, that's great. Yeah, I recall, seeing your work at the AHA and just other things, especially around COVID, and then around representation in all forms. But going off that, given that our theme is talking about being in healthcare, but also taking into account our cultural backgrounds, would love to kind of hear more about your own background, where your family is, kind of their ethnic heritage and how you grew up. But just to start real quick, where are you calling them from today?
I'm in Chicago today.
Excellent. And how's the weather there?
It's gloomy and gross, which is par for the course, but hopefully we'll have a nice weekend.
Yeah, well, I know Chicago summers are pretty fun. It's gloomy today in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm calling from, but we're looking forward to a hopefully not too humid summer. So let's start. Yeah, did you grow up in Chicago? Tell us about kind of that background.
No, I actually grew up in Ohio. My parents, immigrated from India, so we're Indian. They came in the early 70s and relocated to a small town in Ohio called Barberton, Ohio. By the time I was born, they had upgraded to Canton, Ohio. And then by the time I was ready to go to middle school, we had moved to North Canton, which is a town that's about 10 miles north of Canton, Ohio. So grew up in northeastern Ohio. Not a lot of Indian people there, but the Indian people that were there also immigrated around the same time that my parents came. They were either doctors or engineers, and that's sort of their entry point into the United States. So it was an interesting childhood that I didn't think much of as I was going through it, right? I was often the only person of color in any room that I was in. We did have Indian friends, but they didn't go to our schools. They just happened to live in our cities or the cities next to Canton, Ohio. But I didn't necessarily feel like I was the only because I didn't know anything else, right? And it wasn't really until later in life when I was exposed to different environments where I actually, have been in rooms that only have Indian people or only have South Asian people. And it's only in those moments that you look back and you're like, oh, wait, maybe it wasn't normal for me to be the only person in that room. And why didn't I notice it back then? And why didn't it bother me? But it was kind of like, when in Rome, you try to fit in, you try to assimilate to the environment in which you're growing up in, and you try to be successful in it. And that's what we did in Canton, Ohio.
Yeah. Hey, so for context, I know Cleveland, I know Cincinnati, I know a little bit like Dayton is in Ohio.
Yeah.
Where's Canton near?
So Canton is about 40 miles south of Cleveland.
Okay.
It is the home of the Pro Football Hall of
That's
Fame.
right.
So
Yeah.
every summer there's the first kickoff of the professional football season takes place in Canton, Ohio. It's sort of our claim to fame. And North Canton is just a little bit north. And yeah, it's not a big town. It does have a very small town feel. And I don't know how else to describe it. Like, it's not rural by any means. Like, it
Hmm.
felt like a small city, a
Sure.
suburban city. But yeah, it was a good place to grow up.
That's great. It's always, I feel like it's interesting to get context on, even within kind of the AAPI and Asian diaspora, to see like, where you land. It really depends on kind of, and affects where how you grow up, and kind of some outlooks on different things. Fun
Yeah.
fact: when my family first immigrated, my father first immigrated to the U.S. He went to Case Western, and so
Oh,
we
nice.
were in Cleveland. That was before I was born. We ended up going to St. Louis in Missouri, but
Okay.
some Midwest kind of pieces there.
Yeah,
You
well,
talked,
that's how the immigration laws worked, Eddie. Like, those are the only places they gave people the opportunity to go to.
yeah, that's interesting. We might talk about that later. You
Yeah.
talked a little bit about um, this concept of not knowing anything else, right? Like you when you were growing up, maybe oftentimes were the only person of color or Indian person in a room. When did you kind of start to notice something different, I suppose?
I don't even know, like, I know we might talk about like where I went to college and all of that, but when I went to college, there actually were a lot of Indian kids
Hmm.
in my college, but I just didn't feel comfortable like gravitating towards them or hanging out with them. And even in law school, um, and my friends still make fun of me for this, but we had APALSA, which was the Organization for the Asian Pacific American Islander Law Students, and they took group pictures every year. And my
Mm-hmm.
first year, they had group pictures and I didn't show up for the Apollo picture.
Mm-hmm.
Like I didn't want to be in it. And I didn't feel like I fit in it either. Right. Like I didn't feel like it was part of me. But then an hour later, I showed up to be in the business law photo. And
Hmm.
so the person who was president of the Asian Law Association at the time, Sunny Sandu, like he still doesn't let me live down the fact that I didn't show up for that picture. Right.
Sure.
And it's all in good fun, but I really didn't feel like I was part of the Asian community.
Hmm.
Probably until my second or third year of law school, when I had the opportunity to hang out with these folks. They called me out on some of my sort of thoughts and ideas and challenged me to be part of them and be better. And then, after becoming a lawyer, I was able to move to the DC area, you know, 8 years or so into the practice of law, and I had access to the South Asian Bar Association. And I think that's when I really sort of dug into it and began to assimilate and realize that these are my people and I really enjoy hanging out with them. But I think because of where I grew up and how I was the only, it took me a long time to see myself as part of this community.
Yeah, no, that's really good background and context.
How about
It's
you? Did you
yeah,
feel that way?
no, I was about to say, so for me, yeah, I grew up in, I mean, like I said, I was born in the Midwest, moved west and for a little bit, but I mostly grew up in the Northeast. And so my parents, we went to like church, and it's called it was a Chinese church, and so
Mm-hmm.
definitely aware that I had like non-Asian friends and Chinese friends, right? In fact, I remember my maybe eighth birthday, I had two birthday parties. One was like my Chinese church friends, and one
Uh-huh.
was like my um non-Asian, school friends. And in me, I guess I was like, oh, I don't know if this group would be able to hang out with this group. And
Yeah.
now I found joy in kind of bringing people from all different kinds of backgrounds together, regardless of
Yeah.
who they are, and how I know them. But it is interesting just as a kid, to kind of have that experience. And for me, I'll say this is that I was definitely wrestling with being kind of figuring out, like, am I Asian? Am I American? Like, what does that look like? Obviously, I'm American. I was born here, but you know, even, and I was going to ask you this later too, but when I was in sixth grade, we ended up having this like Asian lunch table. And
Yeah.
so it was kind of like that movie Mean Girls where it's like the nerdy Asians and the cool Asians. I was not a cool, just for context, I was not a cool Asian, right? So I was,
Yeah.
but I had a lot of fun with my friends. But then we definitely like were like, oh, everyone here at this table is Asian. Like, why is that? Like, what's going on? And during that time, it was kind of this like, kind of edgy, like ASEAN, like representation kind of a chapter of my life. And I think in some ways it was cool because I, for the first time, could like kind of like articulate some things. I mean, I wasn't that
Yeah.
articulate or, good at communicating, but rather like there are things that didn't need to be said that otherwise would have been needed to said in other contexts. Explain like, well, this is why maybe I smell a certain way because like my family cooks, right? Like and everyone has a smell, I
Yeah.
suppose. Everyone's family, and it's like, well, we all when we go to each other's houses, we take off our shoes, right? Like
Yeah.
that. Those are just like day to day, daily different things. Or like, I'll give a final example is like growing up for us, like especially from a Chinese background, we didn't really have too many like household pets, and so getting a
Hmm.
cat in fifth grade was like huge.
Yeah.
And so something like those are all really interesting. And I'll say lastly, a turning point for me was around seventh grade. A friend of mine, he's actually I think his um, he's kind of half like Korean and half Caucasian, but he showed me this YouTube channel. Shout out to Wong Fu Productions. They're kind of a YouTube production short film
Uh-huh.
type group on YouTube, and they kind of made videos that were talking about this Asian American experience, right? And that was very early on. But I said, oh, this is like I could see myself growing up to be like these guys somehow, right? And still
Yeah.
be successful and not have to be acting a different way, let's say, than what I'm used to. So it's like, how do you marry those together? Um,
Yeah.
did you
And
experience any of that?
yeah, I mean, all of it. And I feel like I had Indian friends when I was young, but I put them in like this different category where they were like partially family, but
Mm,
also like I don't think I truly valued and appreciated those friendships until I was much older. Like
mm,
we would get together in groups and we would be together, right? Because our parents were friends and we did stuff together too. And they were
kids
my
table.
friends. Yeah, the kids' table, or, there were another set of sisters that I grew up very closely with, and we ended up going to the same schools. And we were always together, but I guess I just still always felt alone because even if it was the four of us, like me and my younger sister and those two sisters, like
Mm,
it was still just the four of us, right? Like we were still alone. And, when you said the smell comment, I mean, my mom used to cook all the time and we didn't have those hood fans that you can get now. And so me and my sister used to keep Febreze in the car and we'd like
mm-hmm,
Febreze ourselves before we went into school. And
mm,
that all came because kids made fun of us because we smelled weird, right? Or they made fun of us because we brought different types of foods to school. And I remember we had like cultural day in
mm-hmm.
sixth grade, and I took lemon rice, which was one of my favorite things. And everyone was making fun of it and calling it
Oh
fluorescent
man.
rice because it was yellow. And I was like, and no one wanted to try it, right? And it was just those types of things that you go through that sort of work against your confidence, right? Like
Yeah.
your confidence as a person, your confidence as a member of the class or the group that you're in. And
Right.
so they're subtle, they're not intentional, they're not mean, but they kind of play into how you see yourself as you grow up
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, it's interesting. At work, we were doing a training, and this is really good that my workplace does this on, internal bias and microaggressions. And one of the words that came up was like othering, right? Like, feeling othered. You touched upon it a little bit. It's unfortunate to hear, but I've experienced the same thing.
Yeah.
Bringing in food. Like, were there and just let you don't have to comment on this if it's too sensitive. But like, were there things growing up that like you were like made fun of for, or you noticed that like was very different than like, let's say, your non-Asian or non-person of color colleagues and students?
Yeah, I mean, the color of my skin, right? Like I was darker than everyone else. Indians tend to be hairier. I got made fun of having hairy arms all the time.
Mm.
And just, it was just challenging in ways. And I don't mean to say in any way that I didn't have a good childhood, because I remember being a kid as being really fun, and I still wish I
Yeah,
could go
same.
back to being a kid, right?
Don't
Um,
we all?
yeah, but it was always challenging in some ways to sort of bridge the cultural divide between the lives we needed to live in the United States and the upbringing that our parents had
Mm.
in India, right? So my parents had the ideas for what our lives should be like, because that's how their lives play out. And so, really strict rules for girls and what we were allowed to do and what time we
Mm.
were allowed to come home. I mean, my curfew in high school was 9 p.m. and none
Mm.
of my friends had that type of curfew. And so I always felt a little left out, but I developed coping mechanisms, right?
Mm.
Like I signed up for literally every club. And so I was so busy.
Yeah.
So by the time a weekend came around, I was exhausted by 9 p.m. and I didn't want to be out later. But that was
Mm.
like a coping mechanism to deal with the fact that that was just the rule of our house. And now looking back on it, I'm kind of glad I had it, right? Because it
Right.
got me engaged and involved in so many things that I've benefited from that I wouldn't have. But I did feel left out at times, right? I felt like I couldn't do the things that all my classmates were doing.
Mm.
And that was sort of driven by cultural norms that they had based on their experience of growing up in India. Um, that being said, my parents have evolved a lot, and their
Mm-hmm.
thinking around things have changed a lot since that time of growing up. So it's been really fantastic to see their cultural progress too over time, and how we've turned out after having those experiences
Sure.
and still sort of going to college and then grad school and then living separate from them and building our own sort of paths.
Yeah. One thing I've thought about as I've slowly grown older, it's just as we grow older, our parents grow older, and um, we educate them just as like they were teaching us, like obviously like how to
Yeah.
walk and eat and all this stuff. Now it's like we're helping explain, maybe that's trends, anything from trends to like how a certain thing works or like what's going on, and it's just interesting to see that. Um so we're gonna kind of transition very soon into kind of more career path, but I'm
Yeah.
curious, what as a kid, and actually before this, so you mentioned you have a younger sister. So
Yeah.
were you the oldest?
No, I have an older sister too.
Okay. So you're a middle.
I'm a
That's
middle.
that's interesting. So what I was gonna ask, and I'll give some context. I'll explain for myself too. Like, child of immigrants, that's like one thing, right? I'm a
Yeah.
first child of Chinese immigrants, and so for me, it was a lot of like, Eddie, you can't drive, like that's so dangerous, and I was like the latest of my friends to like learn how to drive, and like, finally, I did it, and then with my brother, like, and like SATs, like in China, they have one test that determines their entire life, so they
Mm-hmm.
they see the SAT, that's the college related exam, they're like, you have to get 2400 or 1600 or
Yeah.
whatever it is on this thing, even though at the time, U.S. college admissions were a lot more holistic, right? And I think even now, both undergrad and graduate programs are, some of them forego these standardized testing,
Mm-hmm.
being aware of some of the
Yeah.
sensitivities that and kind of different populations go through. But it was kind of like all that. And then when my brother came up, to be fair, he's like, I think he's definitely like a faster learner than I am. I personally think I work harder, but
Yeah.
um but they were kind of like, oh yeah, you're 16, go get a permit, like, so what, real quick, like what, middle child, like how was that for you?
Well, my older sister is about 6.5 years older than me. So I think according to like how that mapping of children's personalities go,
Right.
I technically become another oldest child because there's that gap
Mm.
between us. But I definitely have middle child syndrome a lot of times. I feel like no one loves me as much as they love the others. Like
Mm.
I'm not getting the same things as everyone else. Like there's less pictures of me, like all of that
Oh,
middle
no.
childness is definitely there. But I think like what you were saying, I think my older sister definitely feels that a lot, right?
Mm.
Like that she had to sort of fight and try for everything, and nothing was easy for her. And then she saw me and my younger sister, who's 2.5 years younger than me, sort of get everything a lot easier and be able to do more things than she was able to do. And I think that's just the way it goes when you're immigrants, right? Like this, I can't even imagine what it must have felt like to pick up and leave your entire family and everything you've known in your whole
Right.
life to come to another country and then to raise kids. Like that must have been absolutely terrifying for
Yeah.
them. And I think looking back, like, yeah, they did things wrong, but they got most of it right, because we're here and we're successful and we're thriving. And so I think it is like, it's easy to look back and be like, oh my God, that sucked. Like I had this rule, and I shouldn't have had to fight that. But they were just doing the best that they could, given what they knew and what they had available to them. And they wanted to protect us. And I think they succeeded in that.
Yeah. Well, no, kudos to your parents for
Yeah.
working hard and you know, going through adversity. We're recording this right before Mother's Day, so shout out to the moms and the motherly figures and the fathers and others in our lives. Father's Day is coming up, you know, in June, but
Yeah.
we're recording this in mid-May. What did you want to be when you were growing up as a kid? Like, I mean, multiple things, one thing.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like for a long time, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. My parents are both doctors. It
Hmm.
seemed to make sense. It seemed to be the only thing I really knew about, right? Um, but then I sucked at science. Like I was very, very bad at all of the science subjects. And so that sort of took that away from me. And for a while, you know, I wanted to do business. And I remembered thinking I wanted to be the CEO of like a Fortune 500 company, and that was going to be the path that I took.
Yeah.
But you know, I went to college and majored in finance and economics and really didn't enjoy that at
Mm,
all. And so I went to law school thinking, I don't know that I want to be a lawyer, but law school takes 3 years, and that'll give me 3 more years to figure out sort of what I wanted to do. And I really enjoyed practicing healthcare law. And I sort of landed there, and all of a sudden it made sense
yeah.
that I should be in healthcare in some form or fashion. But I never knew I could be a healthcare lawyer. Like that's not something I knew was a possibility when I was a kid.
Right.
And then when I transitioned and moved to the AHA and took on a policy role, I never knew that existed for me, right?
Right.
And then I morphed into like creating a think tank at the AHA and doing all this thought leadership and education. And, you know, now I have my own company and I'm a law school professor. And like none of these things were things I ever thought about doing as a kid.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, one of the things that the reason I started co-founded the Associated of Asian Healthcare Leaders is because when I was a kid, like, you know, for us, it was kind of like you either be a doctor, a lawyer, or a engineer, or something like that, or you fail, right? And so like
Yeah.
those were the options, and so even if like you, and part of it was because like our parents, depending on kind of how you grew up, that's what you either see them do or like on TV. It's either like, you know, these white collar type jobs or it's like, you know, just like crime, because depending on what type, or like a Power Ranger, right? Like, but I can't be a Power Ranger when I grew up, so it's like
Yeah.
those are some of the things. And so you know, you mentioned you went to Ohio State,
Mhm.
and you mentioned growing up in Ohio, so I'm sure that you know, the was it the Buckeyes, and it's well, I
It's
forgot to
the
mention it's
Ohio State University. Yes.
the yes, I know that they trademarked the recently.
Yeah.
What, how was the college application and that journey? Was that a pretty straightforward process, or did you think about going else? You have dream schools, things like that.
Yeah, so when I was just very afraid to leave home.
Mm,
You know, and I was one of those kids, like I never wanted to leave. If I had continued to get really great jobs one after another in Ohio, I probably never would have left. I just really wanted to be close to home.
mm,
So I applied to a bunch of schools in Ohio and then to the University of Michigan, and that was it. Like I think I applied to 5 or 6 schools max. Um, and, you know, spring break of my senior year, we went to like visit the schools, right? So we went to Miami of Ohio, and then we went to Ohio State, and then we were going to come home for a day and then go to Michigan. And as we were touring the schools, like I just fell in love with the Ohio State campus. Like I've learned now, 25 years later, that like to trust my instincts and my gut. And that was like one of those moments where I just felt so at home there. And it was one of those things. And I got a really sizable scholarship there. And so I came back and I talked to my dad and I said, look, it's going to be free. I really want to go there. I've directly enrolled into the honors program, which they only let the business school and the honors program in this special cohort, and they only pick 30 people to be part of it. Right. Like this is right. Like I have to go here. And my mom really wanted me to go to University of Michigan. And I was just like, no, I'm going to go. And so my dad like gave me the check and we filled out all the paperwork, and he's like, why don't you go take it to the post office, and then we'll tell your mom where you're going, right? And so we did, and she wasn't too happy about it. And from her perspective, rightfully so. Like when we were touring these campuses and they were going through sort of the average ACT score, the average SAT score, I mean, Ohio State was by far the lowest at that time. And it had this reputation that if you had a heartbeat, you could get into Ohio State. And it's very different now. It's actually pretty challenging to get into Ohio State, especially as an in-state student. But back then it was fairly easy. But I had the right mix, right? Like I had the direct enrollment, I had the scholarship, I had direction and guidance around what I wanted to do. So it just seemed right to me. And I think, looking back, maybe I could have gone elsewhere and exposed myself to different things, but I like where I got to in my life, and Ohio State was part of it.
No, that's great. There's certain times I think in my life, and you've said it now too, that it's one of those things where maybe your brain is trying to think one thing and it says like this is the right way, but then your gut feels like, oh, this feels right in a way, and it's hard to explain that. And so, kudos to you for following your gut. I'm sure. I don't know the case at the time, but in-state tuition is always nice, financially. Yes. So you talked, you mentioned it earlier that you kind of pursued, business, and when you were an undergrad, even though when you were growing up, you wanted to be a doctor. But now here you are, you're still in healthcare. Of course, the name of this podcast is Asian Faces Healthcare Places. So you're in a healthcare place. Where did the healthcare kind of come back in undergrad, if any?
Not in undergrad, really. It was actually the summer between my first and second year of law school. I had the opportunity to work at a law firm called Buckingham, Doolittle, and Burroughs, and they had a pretty significant health law practice, which again, I didn't know was a thing, right? So
what did you think, like when you became a lawyer, coming out of undergrad, like what did you think was going to happen, or what did you want to do?
So I thought I wanted to do corporate law. Like I thought I was just going to work and do transactions for different corporations. And in a way, that's where I ended up, just in healthcare, right? So I ended up becoming a healthcare transactional attorney, and that required me to learn all the healthcare regulations, but then also be able to do those business transactions. So I kind of did both, and I just didn't know. I mean, law school was very different than it is now. Like right now, I teach at Loyola's health law certificate program, right? And I'm going to be teaching at Ohio State in the fall as well, as they, expand the health law classes that they offer. But when I was in school, that wasn't a choice. Like there were no health law classes to take. And so there were business classes, there were corporate law classes. And so that's where I thought I would land up. But that summer, I got the opportunity to work on all of these different health law matters for different clients. And so at the end of the summer, when they said, where do you want to land? I was like, obviously healthcare. It makes so much sense in retrospect. I mean, and it did, because my parents always talked about medical stuff, right? Like that was the dinner time conversation. And so when I started doing health law and I'm thinking about Medicare and Medicaid and all these things, these are terms that like, I had heard regularly as a kid, and
Mm,
it kind of just made it come easier to me, and it made sense. But again, who knows? Who knows where I would be if I didn't summer at that law firm specifically and get
right.
exposed to these things.
Well, our path is our path, and it's cool to
Yeah.
see how, the sum of our experiences is kind of who we are in some ways.
Yeah.
When you applied to that firm, were you thinking about doing law, health law, or did it was kind of like
No.
they're like, "Hey, welcome, like you're gonna do health law this summer."
I just was so happy to have a job. Like, I mean, I sucked at law school, right? Like, I had horrible grades, and no one tells you when you go into law school that the the only semester that really matters is your first semester, because that determines where you get a job after your
Sure.
first year, which ultimately determines where you get a job after your second year and where you get a permanent job, right?
Mm,
So I did not do well my first semester of law school. It was a really hard transition for me. I went from like not having to study very much and get straight A's to actually like studying my butt off and getting B's and C's.
mm,
And that was just really hard for me. It was a
mm,
hard thing for me to be okay with. And then I started applying for jobs, and I couldn't get interviews anywhere because, again, my grades weren't that great. Right. And so that summer, I ended up working 2 free jobs
mm.
and like working like 60 hours a week
Wow.
just so that I could get experience, right? Because I
Right.
didn't have the grades. So I knew I needed to get experience. And so I worked at Legal Aid, and I worked at the Ohio Consumers Council, and I just worked and would do anything that they told me to do. Like any project, I was like, I want to do it all. I want to get as much experience as possible.
Hmm.
And then when I started applying for jobs my second year, I did get some law firm interviews based on that experience,
Right.
not my grades again, because they did not get much better the second semester, right? Um, and I sent out, I think, like 200 plus
Wow.
applications because I was like, I need a job. Like, I
Right.
can't
You need a
not have a
job.
job,
Yeah.
right? Like, I can't go to law school and then not have a job. That was not acceptable to me. And so I sent out so many resumes, and I ended up getting an interview with Buckingham and really hitting it off with the attorney that interviewed me. And she's still a good friend and mentor to me even today.
That's
Like,
great.
um, but I just clicked. Again, it was one of those things where it just felt right. And then I went and I interviewed with more of the attorneys, and it felt right. And then when I got the offer, I didn't care what kind of law they wanted me to do. I was just so excited to have
Yeah.
like a job at a law firm the summer after my second year.
Right.
But it turned out great. Like, I enjoyed the attorneys I got to work with. I made really great friends. Like, I ultimately got hired into the health law practice group, and the partner that was my supervising attorney, Tom Hess, like, we still talk regularly. Like, he just nominated me and I got on a board and we're serving on it together. Like, those people that helped me get that job and helped train me to be a health law attorney, like, they're still in my life and they're still rooting for me and cheering me on, like, what, 5 jobs later, 20
Yeah.
years later.
Yeah.
So it's really cool how relationships form and connections are made over time.
Yeah, that's great. Let that be a lesson to anyone who's listening into the future that don't burn bridges. It's important to keep those
Yeah.
relationships. And it seems like you're doing this, give back, right? Like you're
Mhm.
teaching now the future generations of health law folks and lawyers, and so you're really shaping, and so you can kind of see that. To me, it seems like a cascade effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love teaching. It is so rewarding to me to see people learn and start to think differently. And because I'm teaching healthcare payment and policy, and I can really develop the curriculum the way I want to, you know, we can talk about health equity and we can talk about the future of healthcare in a very real way,
Yeah.
and how all the players play together and what is truly working and what is broken. And I think that is great from a purpose of giving back and teaching the next generation. But it's been really great for me too to be able to think about healthcare more globally.
Yeah.
I think because so much of my career was in the hospital space,
Hmm.
that I got very focused around what hospitals and health systems were doing. And by teaching payment and policy across the whole healthcare ecosystem,
Right.
I'm paying more attention to payers and drug companies and how different processes are working within our system, which has been really eye-opening for me too.
No, that's fantastic. So let's kind of go into after law school, your first role, and eventually I think you made your way to DC. How was that path after law school?
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, working at a law firm is hard. It is a lot of hours. It is actually learning the law, because what you learn very quickly when you start working is that law school trains you to think like a lawyer, but it doesn't actually train you to be a lawyer. And there's so much to learn, like even little things like I had to learn how to use a dictaphone and to like write letters via dictaphone, right? Like that
Wow.
was not how my brain thought, right? Like I did everything by typing it on a computer, and I had to learn how to write briefs, and I had to learn how to make legal arguments in succinct ways that best advocated for clients. And I learned things I never even thought about in law school. And so it was rewarding and it was challenging. And, it set me up nicely to go in-house and represent hospitals and health systems. But then even that was an eye-opener. Like I remember early on, I had a client within ProMedica, and she called and she was like, well, can I do this? And so I looked at the regulation and I was like, I called her back and I was like, no, you can't. And she was like, that's not your job. Your job is to not just tell me no. Your job is to help like me figure out a way to do it. Like, so go back and figure out a way for me to do it. And so I went back and I came back and I said, well, I think you could do it if you hire 2 FTEs to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't have any money. Go back and figure out a way for me to do this without adding 2 FTEs, because I don't have budget to add 2 FTEs. And it was in that moment that I realized that like when you move from a law firm to in-house, you actually become a partner in their business. And so that was a good learning experience for me. And that really allowed me to understand the business of healthcare, right? Yes, I was a lawyer, but I was sitting at the leadership table and I got to listen and learn about everything that was happening, and then figure out how we make sure that the work that we're doing aligns with all of the laws and regulations that we need to follow, right?
Yeah.
But it really gave me that eye into sort of how hospitals operate, how C-suite leaders think, how they make decisions, what goes into the process of the sales cycle or any cycle within how they're making decisions about what moves forward and what doesn't. And then I had the really great opportunity to move to MedStar and be essentially general counsel for Georgetown University Hospital and Washington Hospital Center. And that opened my eyes to whole new different things that, I didn't experience at ProMedica, which was based in Toledo, Ohio. And that was an interesting experience too, because both of those hospitals had completely different cultures. And so they had completely different roles that they wanted their in-house attorney to play, and sort of navigating both of those at the same time was quite challenging, to be honest. But it just really added a new layer to my experience in understanding that, being an in-house attorney at one place is not the same as being an in-house attorney at another place, right? And then I decided to try something new and moved into the policy space, which was so cool. Like, I think my second or third day of working at the AHA, like I had a meeting on the Hill, and it was actually in the Hill. Like it wasn't in one of the Senate offices. It was actually with Nancy Pelosi's healthcare aide. And we were in like the basement of the Capitol building. And it was just, I was like, I've made it, man. This is the coolest job I will ever have in my life. Right. And I still have, on a bulletin board in my other room, like I still have the visitor pass that I got that day, because I thought it was the coolest thing in the whole world. And, learning about inpatient payment policy and understanding sort of how the process works to move things forward from a regulatory perspective or from a legislative perspective was just it was just really fun, right? And so I did that for about 4 years, and then had the opportunity to create a think tank that looks at healthcare costs and affordability. And that was a really cool experience to build something sort of from scratch that we had no idea what it was going to look like. So I just tried different things and we saw what stuck, and it was just cool. It was every step of the way I was learning. I was using different skills that I had developed over my career.
Right.
And then that role kind of morphed to a broader role around strategic initiatives. And I took on work related to health equity, to maternal health, several different roles during the pandemic. And it's been a nice evolution and growth in the type of work I'm doing. And I look back on it and it kind of all makes sense. Like this path all built to today. But I didn't know this path existed when I started my career. Like if you would have told me 20 years ago this is what I was doing, I would have like laughed in your face, right?
Right.
But it's fun and I love it.
Did you ever have like a Legally Blonde moment, or like you were kind of like, I've made it as a, I mean, you have had so many roles like in-house and with firm and then moving the policy, but like let's go early stage in your career. Is there a moment or a time where you're like, wow, I'm like doing stuff?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suffer from imposter syndrome a lot. So in most of the situations I've been in, I have not thought I deserve to be there until after I have succeeded. And then I move on to the next one. And I'm like, oh yeah, I totally own that last gig, but I don't think I can do this one. Right. And so that's sort of how I've been in every stage. And the imposter syndrome has gotten less with each move I've made, because I think I can look back and be like, oh yeah, I had that. Like I did that. I accomplished that. That was pretty good. But I still have it every day. And, I know we're going to talk later about what it's like to start a new company, but it's imposter syndrome on steroids, man. Like it is every day. Did I say the right thing? Wait, are they going to think I shouldn't be there? Or wait, are my services really adding value to the business that my clients are doing? And what will they think if I propose this pay structure for my services? And it's a lot of different things that I've not had to do before in my career. And so you wonder, like, are you doing it right or are you not? And the only thing you can do is try to get as much information about what's happening in the market and what other people are doing, and then build your products and see if people buy them. Right. That's all you can do, is like put it out in the universe and see what happens. And for someone who likes to make plans and likes to know what's going to happen and feel the validation, it causes a lot of anxiety. But at the same time, it's really fun. Like it's fun to create something that is yours and your own, and then find people that buy into it and want what you're offering. And it's very rewarding.
No, that's great. It's inspiring as I kind of create and take the leap into making this content to hopefully help inspire and give kind of light to the faces that we see on LinkedIn or in the spaces as in this healthcare field. I thought about what you said on making a company and the challenges that come with it, but also the excitement. I feel like you had probably some of that experience doing that kind of brainstorming and really creating that think tank within AHA. Like, I assume that wasn't given to you, right? Like you probably saw it or saw the opportunity. Like what was that real quick?
Yeah. So I was in the policy shop and we were having conversations with our hospital members around affordability and value and what is the role, for hospitals to play in that work. And I had raised my hand within the policy team and said, hey, I want this as an issue. And I was essentially told, no, we're not giving it to anyone. Like, put your hand back down. That's not an option, right? But then more globally, we were having these conversations and I started to hear sort of whisperings that our board was looking at a way to address it and potentially creating like a think tank of sorts that could look at just this issue, that would research it, that would provide best practices, that would do all of this stuff. And so I was fortunate enough to go to lunch with a friend, and she was like, well, you need to call the COO and you need to just tell her that this is what we need to do. This is how it should be structured. And this is why you're the right person to lead it. And I was like, I've talked to the COO 3 times in my entire life. Like, I am not picking up the phone and pitching this idea to her. Like, that's crazy, right? And she was like, no. And she kept talking through lunch about why I'm the right person, the skills that I offer. And so by the end of lunch, I was like, maybe I should do this. So we walked back to the office from the restaurant we were at, and she just stands in my office and she's like, okay, send the email. And I was like, no, let me think about it. And she's like, no thinking. We already thought at lunch, like, you've got to pitch this idea. And so I sent the COO, Mary Jane, an email, and she wrote back quickly and said, yes, let's set up time to talk about this. And we had time, and I wrote this outline, and I brought my resume and I annotated it with everything I wanted to like highlight. And she gave me the floor in the call. And so I talk about what I think we should develop, how it should be structured, what parts of the work we should be doing. And then I went through my resume and I said, this is why I'm the right person to lead it. And it was dead silence. And I was like, I have just like signed my death warrant at this organization. Like, there's no, like, I can't go back to just doing my old job now that they know that this is what I want to do. And I've pitched it. And she starts talking and she's like, I'm so sorry. It took me a while to like take in everything you said. She's like, but this sounds great. Let's make it happen.
There you go.
And so, 6 months later, we had written my job description. We had taken it through the whole process, and I got to build this thing, which was called the Value Initiative. And it's 5 years old now, still around, still producing resources, even after I've left the AHA. And so I don't know how long it lasts. I don't know how long it stays, but it was 5 years of my life, and we created some really, really great resources. And I was incredibly proud because early in the pandemic, we decided to focus on not early in the pandemic, before the pandemic, we decided to focus on strategies that we thought would help prepare hospitals and health systems for the future of value-based payment, right? So strategies around health equity, around addressing social determinants of health, team-based care, telemedicine, and virtual health strategies. And so we really worked on that for like 2.5 years, and then the pandemic came. And those were the strategies that hospitals needed to rely on in order to continue moving forward in the pandemic. And when we were scrambling as an association to say, do we have resources on how to do this type of virtual care, or how to do this, or how a team-based care program should look, like, they came to my team, and my team had them. We had all of that work. And so that's like one of the things I'm most proud of in my career, is that we were able to anticipate the right things that were needed. And I could have never said, oh, we're going to have a global pandemic and we need to have these resources ready. But it was that instinct and that ability to listen to what we were hearing in the healthcare field and say, this is where we need to focus. And I don't know if that was, my instinct, my team's instinct, just what our members were telling us. So it was the hospital instinct or some conglomeration of that, but it worked out very nice.
That's amazing. Kudos to, the COO, to be able to listen to you as a leader, to say, hey, I'm not above listening to the ideas of the folks who are super valuable to our organization. And you can see the fruits of that now. But also kudos to your colleague and friend for kind of pushing you. I think, like, especially like you mentioned, and I at times suffer through this too, like imposter syndrome, that'll really hold you back, right? And you're kind of like, what am I doing here? Am I supposed to do this? Am I allowed to? And I think that goes back into even like when I think about, Chinese culture or Asian culture, it's like a lot of like, they say like honor and shame. And I'm not saying I'm the most educated on knowing that
Yeah.
type of cultural experience, but it's, I've been in experiences where, they're like, oh, well, can you present this to like leadership? And I'm kind of like, really? Like, you want me to, I was just gonna like, propose this, and then they're like, no, you should own it. Like, this is your idea. And then,
Yeah.
so, that's incredible. I do want to touch real quick on, um, I was looking at your LinkedIn, and I saw you were also engaged with the AHA's, kind of diversity summer enrichment program. And
Yeah.
I think that program, or just the larger umbrella org, and I noticed that in particular because when I was in graduate school, I applied through, kind of the program there, and ended up taking another offer. But I
Yeah.
definitely, I always share that opportunity with, first year, MHA or MBA or MPH students especially. What was your
Yeah.
experience with that? Like, was that kind of, you wanted to volunteer for that, or what was that part?
Yeah. So, I mean, I wasn't super involved with it, but tangentially involved because my team was connected very closely to the Institute for Diversity and Health Equity
Mm,
team. So we would help, where we could, and sort of meeting with the fellows that were selected and being able to like serve as a resource for them or potentially give them sort of work to work on. And so um, there were several fellows through that program that got to work on early projects for the Value Initiative and help us build sort of our bank of resources for hospitals and health systems. I had another fellow that was really interested in the maternal health work, and
mm,
so really put her skills and her interests to work in helping to develop tools and resources around maternal health for hospitals and health systems. And so that was really where my connection was. But you know, those programs are so great and invaluable in terms of real world experiences. And I know the summer and fall enrichment programs like place you within hospitals and health
right.
systems. And then we had another fellowship program that placed folks in the AHA itself. And
Mm,
so all of those just sort of provide different types of experiences. And I will say, like, working in general at a large trade association or a large hospital or health system is just going to give you sort of a high level overview of sort of everything that's going on in healthcare, which is really, really cool, right? Like it's really cool to be able to understand the big picture while you're working on smaller projects.
no, that's a great piece of advice, I think, especially for early careerists.
Yeah.
You talked about maternal health, and I'm going to pivot to kind of your new opportunity. And I know there's a lot in
Yeah.
between, and I think we'll hopefully soon, not too wasting too much time, get to that. But yeah, talk about your new venture. I think you've alluded to it, and now I want to hear
Yeah.
more. How'd you come up with the idea? What are you working on? What's the plans?
Yeah. So kind of building on what I just said, like being in the roles that I've had, I've really gotten to see healthcare from a lot of different vantage points, and I've gotten to see the good and the bad. And one of the areas that it became clear to me very early on that we had more bad than we should have is in maternal health,
Hmm.
right? So we are, as a nation, like last place in
Hmm.
comparison to other developed countries when it comes to maternal health. Um, we have women who are like literally dying or suffering significantly in what should be one of the best moments of their lives,
Hmm.
right? Like they're bringing a baby into the world. And then outside of maternal or reproductive health, the more I learned, the more I realized that we weren't actually addressing women's health systematically across the continuum of their lives, right?
Hmm.
So we only focus really on maternal health or reproductive health,
Hmm.
and we're doing very badly at that. But we're eliminating like 2/3 of a woman's life that doesn't involve the reproductive cycle,
Hmm.
right? And so I wanted to be a part of this growing conversation around women's health, because it's exciting, right? But the reality is we haven't scratched the surface on women's bodies, right?
Hmm.
We don't have enough clinical research on how women's bodies react to different things.
Hmm.
We know that there are conditions that exist only in women, conditions that, you know, exist mostly in women, and then conditions that appear differently in women. And we haven't done the research we need to on those conditions to understand the best way to diagnose and treat women who face those conditions, right? And so there's all this percolating in my brain. And then I start to realize that we don't really, as women, know enough about our own bodies. Like, we don't talk about the things that we should be talking about. And I'll just give you an example, right? Like, I'm 44. Technically, perimenopause could have started for me at the age of 40. I have not had a doctor ever talk to me about menopause, right? And I was at a women's health conference last year, and there was a speaker talking about, all the different symptoms of perimenopause. And I was like, wait, say what? Like, I thought it was just hot flashes, right? And so even myself working in healthcare, growing up with a family of doctors, I didn't know this stuff about my body. And I think that there needs to be more done. And so women just really aren't getting what they need out of the healthcare system, or even just out of society and how we think about and talk about women's health. And so I knew when I left the AHA that I wanted to focus on women's health. And it took a few months, and I came up with the concept of New Health, which is my company that's focused solely on improving health and healthcare for women. And doing that in 3 different ways. So the first is through strategic and advisory services to support organizations that are moving forward with new ways to deliver care to women. So that can be startups, providers, investors. The second sort of area of work is around education and thought leadership for healthcare professionals, so that they can really understand the importance of women's health, and why we need to be making investments in it, and what the ROI around those investments is. And then the third is sort of building a grassroots network of women that have the tools and resources that they need, so that they can advocate for themselves in the healthcare system, right? So that they can know what is happening with their health. They can understand that they aren't alone in facing those conditions just because no one else is talking about them, right? And they can ask for the right things from their care providers and understand how to sync up with people who are looking out for their best interests within healthcare. And so those are the 3 areas I really want to focus on. And I think they're all really interconnected in how we move forward to improve care.
No, that's great. It's certainly a variety, but like you said, to kind of tackle this issue and address it, you need to think creatively and think holistically. Hopefully we have a little bit of time. I just want to touch upon, you talked about imposter syndrome, and then, here you are, you're starting this whole new venture. You're leaving what I assume was at least, providing a life, and, salary to most entrepreneurs. When they start, they don't have that, right? So what was going through your mind when you thought about that?
So I saved a lot before leaving, and I saved enough so that if I didn't have income for 2 years, I would be fine.
Okay.
And I was very fortunate to be in a position to do that. And I know that everyone isn't able to, but I was. And so that de-risked it a little bit. Sure. I had a lot of conversations with my parents, who have been incredibly supportive. And, my dad is so funny. He'll be like, well, you never used your college fund because you got scholarships. So that's sitting there, and you're still not married. So we have money in the marriage fund. And so don't worry about it. Don't be scared. And so having their support, even knowing that I was never going to take their money, like having their emotional support, right, and having their backing helped de-risk it a little bit too. Sure. And then my sisters were great. I mean, when I came up with this idea, they were like, yeah, we thought you should have done that a long time ago. Right? And so, having their support as well. And then I have so many friends and colleagues, especially in the healthcare space, who all were like, you got to do this. This is great. Like, go for it. And so all of those things sort of de-risked it. to the point where I was willing to do it. Right now, if I had had no savings and no support from outside sources, would I have done it? Probably not. I mean, that would have been way too risky for me. But I was able to de-risk it in a way that made sense for my
Got
life.
it.
And that
No,
equation is different for everyone.
right.
And it's different depending on where you are in your life. Like I have 20 years of work experience now that I can bring to consulting in a way that no one else can, because I don't know
Right.
anyone else who's had the path that I've had. And that doesn't make my path more or less special, but it does influence the advice that I can give. And I think that can be very beneficial to people who are trying to navigate new care delivery models, who are trying to figure out how those models can be paid for. Startups who have no idea how to engage or work with hospitals or health systems. Like, I know how they think, I know how they talk, because
Right.
I've worked with them, for them, among them for the last 20 years, right? And so, it was worth trying. And I'll say 6 months in, like, is going way better than I could have ever imagined.
That's awesome.
I've been able to start doing work on all three of those areas. My life is crazy though. I feel like I went from having one job to having like 10.
Sure.
And I work a lot more, but it's my work and it's my passion. And
Right.
I really, even on the bad days, like I love it. Like I love that I've given myself the opportunity to try something different.
That's amazing. I can't tell you, in my role, right now, it's talking to companies, really more to recruit them to a certain region. But a lot of times, just having come from more of a healthcare delivery background myself, I find them, and being on the innovation side, giving them unsolicited advice, right? But now you're giving them, I guess, solicited advice based
Solicited
on your
advice, yeah.
experience and having been in innovation and engaged with startups, wanting to engage with and work in a healthcare system. I can tell you that our, God bless them, our in-house legal counsel, they're very thorough. It's like
Yeah.
I would never have thought like this whatever word. I'm like, wow, like this word we're gonna hinge this entire agreement on like this word or something like that. And so
Yeah.
no, that's fantastic to hear, and I appreciate how you called out and I think addressed, acknowledged kind of how it's different for each founder, right? For each person, and the backgrounds matter, the experiences matter. So as we wrap up the time, I have a couple grab bag questions.
Okay.
So looking at your LinkedIn, it's such an interesting one. I know you went to the Ohio State University, and you talked about as a kid, and your mom wanted you to go to University of Michigan. It looks like you've kind of fulfilled that promise in some end,
I
but you
did.
also, as a Buckeye, went to Michigan. So what was the thought and background there?
So I went to the Ohio State University for undergrad and law school. So I was pretty much cemented as a Buckeye in
Right.
those 7 years, right? Like there's no going back after that. But I did get my master's in hospital administration from the University of Michigan, and I I enjoyed the education that I was given. I will never be a University of Michigan football fan, but I do think it is an excellent school, and having that degree has been really helpful to me in my career. And so I always just joke that having gone to both universities, I'm in the best position to say which is better, and I will
Sure.
always land on the Ohio State University.
There you go. Well,
Yeah.
that's a very I'll call it diplomatic answer. Hopefully maybe learn from your time on the
Yeah,
Hill.
well, now I'm going back in the fall to teach it.
Yeah,
Moritz College of Law, so I feel like I'm further cementing myself in
that's
Buckeye Law.
true. You've done all the level. I mean, undergrad, graduate, faculty. There you go.
Yeah.
Um, the other question I had was, you talked about when you were a kid, you didn't think that, one day you would be working on the Hill or health law was a thing. What advice would you give, let's say, 17-year-old you right before college?
I would say to believe in myself and trust my gut. I don't think outside of the one example I gave you about choosing to go to the Ohio State University, I don't think at that point in my life I did enough of trusting how I was feeling and how my body was responding to the choices that I was
Hmm.
making. So I think that would be the one piece of advice would be to trust my gut.
That's great. The other part was, that's at one point. Now, let's say you're 2 years into your career out of law school. What advice would you give that Priya?
Yeah, that Priya needs to know that it's okay to just be herself, right? So there is strength in being who you are and bringing the skill sets that you have to different situations. I think early in my career as a lawyer, I tried to copy what other people were doing and what worked for them. And that wasn't always the best way for me to accomplish things
Hmm.
because it wasn't using my skills and my strengths and my strategies. It was just trying to sort of mimic what I saw others deem successful. And I just, being 44 now and looking back, like, you can't build your life off of trying to copy being someone else. Like, you have
Hmm.
to figure out who you are and what's important to you and then act accordingly, right? Like, I can't copy how a man leads within an organization, because if I do that, I'm not being authentic to who I am as a leader and the empathy that I have and the ability I have to understand where people are coming from and to see the gaps and to give them learning experiences. And so I think there is strength in relying on who we are and knowing who that is. And I didn't know that early in my career.
Great. Two more questions. One's for
Yeah.
us, the audience, and one is for eventually you. But the question is, again, given that this podcast is focused on, not only how you got to where you are and what you're doing right now in healthcare, but also about, our own Asian background. Um, is there anything from your cultural upbringing or heritage that you seen has kind of influenced how you lead or kind of operate and see the world? And what, there doesn't have to be a clear cut quotable answer
Yeah.
either. I think it's just a question.
I think, like, because my parents immigrated here and their goal, much like your parents, I'm assuming, was to have a better life, right? And to work hard to be given those opportunities. I think that work ethic that was built into us as kids has been a tremendous asset. It's also been something that's held us back, right? Because
Hmm.
we are taught to work hard and to keep working, but not necessarily to work smart. And so I think having that work ethic and being able to work hard got us to a point, and then we've got to figure out how to work smart, right? Because we don't have time to keep doing everything for everyone, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm so thankful that I have that work ethic and that I got to the point where I realized, okay, hard work is always going to be in play, but I don't have to do everything.
Hmm.
I can pick and choose what I do. I can hire teams. I can hire different people to do different things. And I think that work ethic, I don't know. Like, I don't know where I'd be if I didn't have that
Hmm.
ingrained in me as a young kid. And the other thing I would just say is family, right? Like, because we were immigrants and because we had our nuclear family here, and that was, we had some cousins, second cousins, and that was wonderful. But like on the day-to-day basis, like, it was the five of us, and we are still so close and so supportive of each other. I don't know that I could do my career without having that support emotionally. My mom will still cook food for me, freeze it in individual servings, and send it to me. Like, I'm 44 years old, but I need that, right? Like,
Yeah.
I need that help, and she's willing to do that for me because that's what Asian mothers do. They cook us food
There you
and they
go.
show us that they love us, and all of those things. Like, I don't think I could be successful without my family and without that work ethic that they ingrained.
That's fantastic. Yeah, my mom, she's gotten really into baking since my brother and I've both left the house, and so she'll occasionally just randomly send out tons of
Yeah.
Asian baked goods that I can't even finish, so I get to share it to my friends. And so my friends are always like looking forward to my impromptu bakery
Yeah.
gifts.
That's
Lastly,
amazing.
this is for you, and I think this is how I want to end up. This first episode is how do we is being collaborative, in your new venture and all the things that you're doing and the AAPI community, everything in general. How can people listening to this help what you're doing right now?
I think just learning more about women's health and understanding whether they are women, taking some time to understand themselves and their bodies. If they are men, taking some time to understand how to be allies to women as we work to improve health and make bigger investments. I also have a virtual series of events that happen every month. So checking out New Health and maybe showing up to one of those to learn more about advocating for women, that would be great. And I think, we recently, and we didn't talk about it on this podcast, but I created a leadership development program for SABA called the SABA Leadership Institute.
Yeah.
And we recently had a conversation on what is, a South Asian attorney's role in improving diversity, inclusion, and equity. And, I think when we have those conversations, oftentimes we focus on like, what are the things we can do? Like we can hire diverse people, we can do this, we can, fight back on microaggressions. But one of the speakers we had this week said that we also need to be selfish and focus on ourselves. And we need to focus on being successful in our jobs, because being successful in our jobs is DEI work in and of itself, right? Because when we are successful and when we can move up in whatever organizations we work in, then we have more agency and authority to make decisions that can further improve DEI. So if we're not doing well in our own careers, then we're not going to have the institutional capital we need to be able to make bigger pieces of change. And so I guess beyond women's health and my company, I would just challenge everyone who's listening to be selfish in some of those ways and to really focus on your own career, but also to look right and to look left to your other AAPI colleagues and other colleagues of color and say, how can I help you so that you also can do better? And so we can sort of elevate our bar as a whole.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you again for your time, Priya. Everyone listening, you heard it here first. The closing and of the first episode of Asian Faces in Healthcare Places. Once again, our guest was Priya Bathija, CEO and founder of New Health, and great background. But you can listen to this podcast on different platforms. But once again, Priya, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks again for tuning into this first inaugural episode. I had a great time talking to Priya Bathija, founder and CEO of New Health, about her journey and how she got to where she is. If you're listening to this podcast and wondering how to support, please share this with your friends and networks. See you next time.